My name is Dr Ted Steele. I rose to Associate Professor in the Australian academic system. I'm a research scientist. I've been in science for 50 years. I've spent many years of research on various aspects of microbiology, infectious diseases, the body's immune response to infectious disease, the mechanisms of immunity. Also, I've worked on the mechanisms of evolution and evolutionary mechanisms. My father was an amateur scientist. He was also a surveyor. He instilled in me at a very young age to ask questions about the universe. I can remember when I was a little boy of 4 to 5 years old, he'd be pointing out the stars to me at night in the backyard. And he used to tell me stories about the stars and Alpha Centauri, the nearest star to us, and the Milky Way galaxy. And in a strange way, he introduced me to the fundamental theories for the origin of the universe, whether the universe began with a big bang or whether it has always been there. It's an infinite universe. And when I was about 17 or 18, I went down to Adelaide University. I went through the system there. I did 9 years in Adelaide. I went through and got my basic degree. Then I did a PhD starting in about 1970-71 with Professor Derek Rowley in the Department of Microbiology. And he gave me the task of understanding mucosal secretory IgA immunity. Mucosal immunity is the immune system of the mouth and the nose and the gastrointestinal tract, and that mucosal epithelial lining makes contact with many infectious diseases, whether they be respiratory tract diseases or whether they be lower bowel diseases like Vibrio cholera. But the principles are the same, and the principles that we were uncovering back there in the late 1960s, early 1970s are extremely important today, because the mucosal secretory IgA system is activated differently from the blood system of immunity. And we'll come to the jab in the arm later. Because I'm leading up to a scientific story here now, an alternative explanation for COVID-19 and the way it's engulfed the globe, which most people don't know about. Myself and my colleagues, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, Professor Reg Kosinski, Dr Robin Lindley, Gensuke Takuro, the director of the Institute for Panspermia and Astroeconomics in Japan, and a number of other collaborators, Dr Darryl Wallace. We have been studying virtually 24/7 the progress of this pandemic when we first became aware of it. I want to talk about this very important concept that Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe laid down from the 1960s through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, till Fred's death in 2001 in his 80s. But then since then, the last 20 years, Chandra has continued the exploration and the scientific work and the publication of papers. They also produced milestone books, and one of them is very important, Diseases from Space. And they published this book in 1979, and I urge all intelligent observers and human beings who want to find out about COVID-19 and understand it to read this book. The idea that the universe is teeming with life is part of the hypothesis of panspermia, which has been a hypothesis around for a long time. In the last 200 years, many serious scientists have taken on board, both in the 19th century, the early 20th century, but the biggest input into marshalling the evidence and all the critical arguments for panspermia, that is, life is coming to Earth continuously and seeding Earth, was by Professor Sir Fred Hoyle and Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe in the United Kingdom. They marshalled the key evidence not only for diseases from space, but for all of the understanding of the interstellar dust, the comets as universal incubators of living systems, and of course understanding why it's possible for carbonaceous meteorites to have microfossils that date to an age older than the Earth or the solar system. So that's the essential evidence for panspermia. There are many other support evidence, but when it arrives on Earth as a pathogen, we get serious pandemics. So that's the other evidence, of course, which we're talking about here with COVID-19. The reason I'm going over this is that I haven't come at this lightly, and everything I'm going to talk about is based on evidence. And I was persuaded that they were correct by the scientific evidence, not by some prejudice on my part, but the hard evidence. So let's just deal with some hard evidence that backs up the claim that the universe is teeming with life. See, this is quite different to what we would normally read about in the media, that we still haven't discovered life in the universe beyond the Earth, that NASA is looking for life in our solar system. The facts of the matter are quite different. The facts are we know that life exists out there beyond the Earth. And when it impacts the Earth like it does in the regular pandemics that strike through flus or coronavirus or any other pathogenic disease like whooping cough and some other bacterial infections, then we know that life exists in the universe. But that's the other part of the story. Let me just deal with the key evidence. And it concerns carbonaceous meteorites. What are they? Meteorites are coming in all the time to the Earth from space. We see them in the night sky, various sizes, but big fireballs that we see coming in, they're usually larger bolides. They could be of 10 metres in diameter, and they are usually fragments of a disintegrating comet where the Earth has passed through a debris trail of a previous comet that has come in from the outer solar system to the inner solar system, come around the sun and then gone back on its normal orbital path. Now, these carbonaceous meteorites are extremely important that underpin the claim that the universe is teeming with life. For the following reason: there are 4 meteorites that have fallen over the last 150 years that have been curated in museums and well preserved. There's the Orgueil meteorite that fell in 1864 in France near the town of Orgueil. There's the Mygai meteorite that fell in 1889 near the town of Mygai in Ukraine. There's the Murchison meteorite that fell in 1969 here in Victoria, Australia, near the town of Murchison. And there's the most recent one that's been well looked at, the Polonnaruwa meteorite that fell in 2012 in Sri Lanka. They are fragments of comets. They are life-bearing in that all of them contain evidence of living, either potentially active living material or previously fossilised material. When the experts, and there's teams of them, different overlapping teams that have examined all of these meteorites by scanning electron microscopy, fracturing techniques under sterile conditions, and also determining the chemical composition across the fossil that they observed and the surrounding embedded matrix in which the fossil's embedded. What are these fossils? They are bacterial cells and higher eukaryotic cells, the sort of cells from which we're composed, which are far more complex than bacteria. And these fossils, these eukaryotic fossils, are usually hard-shelled, single-celled organisms, as you might expect, because that would be the easiest form to fossilise. Bacterial cells have very rigid cell walls, so they also fossilise easily. Now, the important thing about all these meteorites that you find both prokaryote and eukaryote, that is very complex, higher cellular life, fossilised and captured as fossils in all of these meteorites. And they've been cross-checked and independently checked by experts. These fossils in the carbonaceous meteorites exist. Now, as the name implies, carbonaceous implies, well, there must be a lot of carbon in the meteorite, and that's true. They're carbon rich. In fact, they're rich in all of the biochemicals that we understand living systems are composed of here on Earth. They are literally life-bearing, carbon-bearing objects from an extraterrestrial origin. Now, the other important thing to understand about carbonaceous meteorites is they're loosely held. Now, how do I explain that? Just imagine I have an iron meteorite or a granite rock meteorite coming in at 70,000 kilometres an hour into the upper atmosphere of the Earth. That will penetrate the mesosphere, that hit the stratosphere at about 50 kilometres up, and then it will burst and give you a fireball. Quite a large fireball. If it's a rock of 1 foot in diameter would give a large fireball from that type of iron or granite meteorite. Now, by analogy, just suppose I now make a wet sand blob with some rocks in it. That would be a metaphor for the carbonaceous meteorite, loosely held. Now just imagine that's coming in at 70,000 kilometres an hour into the upper atmosphere. As it's coming in, before it gets to the stones that are inside this loosely held meteorite, it will be fragmenting and releasing the fragments of the comet as it trails in to the Earth. So when a carbonaceous meteorite strikes the Earth and starts breaking down at speed, it doesn't ignite as a fireball. It's actually fragmenting and releasing cometary dust. Now, if that meteorite contains viruses that can grow in human beings or another pathogen, those pathogens and viruses are in the cometary dust released in that fragmentation process as it's coming into Earth. Now, of course, the harder, more resistant stones that do not fragment, they then explode. The other important thing about carbonaceous meteorites is this. All of the experts date them to an age of 4.5 billion years old. Now, why is that important? That's important because the Earth accreted at that time. The solar system as we know it now didn't exist 4.5 billion years ago. The Earth as we know it now was starting to form and certainly doesn't exist in the formats it is now. So these fossils captured mature cell-based life, fossilised evidence in the comets, existed before the solar system was formed. Now, since we've got the evidence now from 4 quite independent, well-characterised carbonaceous meteorites, we can legitimately make the deduction that the universe itself is teeming with life. On the night of October 11th, 2019, a large fireball on the 40-degree north latitude line over Jilin in northeast China struck China on that night. And we believe that particular meteorite burst over China in the weeks leading up to the massive ignition of apparent simultaneous infections across China, particularly centred on Wuhan, that triggered this pandemic. That bolide that struck northeast China, 10 to 20 metres in diameter, would have been loosely held, the outer portions of it, the bolide, cryopreserved, living systems with viruses, and they fragment. They don't ignite into a fireball. They fragment and then drift down. And that meteorite dust is a very infective form of the virus, and that's what infects large population groups on scale over wide areas. It would have been dispersed in a large dust cloud of virions in a dust cloud, and that cloud drifted down to target China, but also some of it was captured by the jet streams, the east-west jet streams in the stratosphere, and that's how COVID got distributed around the world. It struck first, though, in China, and the viruses came in viral-laden meteorite dust clouds to contaminate virtually the whole of central China at high dose, and possibly all of China at some degree of dose. The existing genomic sequence data says that the animal jump theory couldn't have happened. There are still people that think it's come from animals on the evidence, but I've gone through the odds. The odds of it occurring are impossible odds. All serious molecular viral evolutionists do not think it came from an animal. If all the evidence is consistent with the viral-laden, rich meteorite, a carbonation arriving over China and dumping its massive load of virus particles into the stratospheric jet streams that orbit the globe, and then the lower ignition in Wuhan, and then the prevailing winds lower down, taking the plume of human passage virus across the Pacific. That's the way they were the first 2 key events that spread this virus from space, through the jet streams and then through the plume of human passage virus, trillions of particles in central China. And that way, if you start from those 2 events, you can pretty well explain everything else that's happened since then. We've talked about the massive ignition of infections in China, and that was a viral laden cloud coming down on scale, contaminating the environment and people, and causing simultaneous infections on scale. Thus, the exponential rise of the epidemic in central China, centred on Wuhan. You're getting effectively simultaneous infections at the same time. It had nothing to do with person-to-person spread. It's all to do with viral laden dust clouds coming in, contaminating the environment or directly infecting people at the time of infall, causing massive numbers of mystery case infections where they got the infection directly from the viral laden dust, not from a previously infected person. Well, the primary spread after the meteorite struck and the fragmented meteorite dust was by two global wind systems. There was the upper stratospheric jet stream, east to west jet stream that orbits the world on the 40-degree latitude band. That's important because that's where all the infections occurred, off that band. It takes 3 days. So that's the first mode of distribution. The other mode, the other viruses that got through that and struck, as the cloud struck central China, that would have caused all those massive infections in millions of people in central China. And that plume, that is the rising air of aerosols of viruses expelled by infected people into the atmosphere, that plume would have been taken by the lower level wind systems west to east across the Pacific. So wind systems are the primary distributors of both the cometary viral laden dust and the human passaged viral laden dust, because it would also be dust. When the particles are in the air, they're also getting involved in the viral particles that have been expelled from human beings are also being protected by the pollution dust in the air and other things that are in the air. So it's the airborne route in both cases that are distributing through prevailing wind systems the viral laden clouds to the world. That's how it spreads. That's how ships at sea get struck, by inadvertently sailing through a viral laden cloud or through surface water of a previous infall and the sea spray infecting the ship. That's the way it spreads globally. It certainly spreads by person to person at individual foci around the world that help to create the plume, but the primary big spreads to creating the pandemic are through the global prevailing wind systems, both upper stratosphere and lower troposphere. The LQ-8 sheep ship, which was coming back empty after delivering a large cargo of live sheep to the Middle East. When it left Bahrain, all of the crew on the ship were PCR tested and they're all negative. But a month later, about 2 weeks out from Fremantle, the captain asked the veterinary surgeon on the ship to check out some of the crew who were saying that were just not feeling the best that day. The veterinary surgeon, who normally looks after animals, has medical training, so he assessed it as a mild cold or flu. He gave medicines. They all recovered. When they got to Fremantle, within a week, all of the deckhands on the ship came down, were PCR positive. The veterinary surgeon, Reb, was PCR negative. All the kitchen hands were PCR negative, and all of the officer class were PCR negative. So the deckhands clearly were struck, and according to the eyewitness reports, they were struck more or less at the same time, 2 weeks out from Fremantle. So there we have an eyewitness account of a strike on a ship at sea, which fits the explanations that I've provided you of the way the disease spreads through the winds. What's significant about the LQ-8 is all the deckhands were the ones that got infected. Those who wouldn't normally be on deck a lot, like the veterinary surgeon, the officer class, and the staff preparing the food, they didn't become infected. So if it, for example, came in through contaminated foods provisions and supplies in Bahrain, it certainly didn't affect the kitchen staff. See, the person-to-person and spread or something coming in from the Middle East just doesn't fit exactly what happened in the case, in that particular outbreak on the ship. The simplest explanation is that it was an airborne aerial attack of COVID-19 through a COVID-19 viral-rich cloud, either striking the ship directly or through the ship sailing through surface waters that had taken a previous infall, and when the sea spray was getting all over the deckhands. In Disease from Space, Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe talked often about isolated regions of the world suddenly going down with the Spanish flu in an inexplicable way. Well, our case with COVID is the same. The sudden outbreak of COVID-19 on the O'Higgins Chilean Army outpost in Antarctica in late December 2020 is a classic example of a remote region being struck by a viral-laden dust cloud. The ship in the bay also came down at the same time. So there was about 50 people in that particular outbreak that came down suddenly with COVID-19, thousands of kilometres from civilization. That particular case in Antarctica is not unusual if you read what happened during the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. You take Alaska, for example. Alaska, it struck in the heart of winter in Alaska. Let's get real here. Alaska is a massive state of the United States. Transportation in those years was only by bobsled, and it took often weeks to get from one village to another. There was no movement of people in Alaska. But all over Alaska, as various teams, medical teams, got into the isolated villages, all they found was devastation, bodies everywhere. How did that happen? It was a real disaster for Alaska. And the reason we know the detail about Alaska in great detail is that Bobby Rigg, the governor of Alaska, was testifying to the Appropriations Committee of the US Congress and the Senate, trying to get money to help the people of Alaska in his state get through the Spanish flu in Alaska. And to get that money, he had to explain what happened in different regions in Alaska. It could not have happened by person to person. It was clearly an infall from the troposphere, from the sky, and it infected the whole of the state, and all isolated regions were struck, more or less at the same time. There was no person-to-person spread in the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 in Alaska, and that's graphically described in their book, Diseases from Space. Now, it's not as if, as I said, Fred and Chandra are unusual. There are many other papers describing the global transport of pandemic viruses in the winds, in the tropospheric winds. It's well documented. It's not as if this is something special. It's just it's got to be emphasised now with the urgency that I'm doing to kill the myth off that somehow everything is transmitted person to person. It's not. The major infections, the major explosive infections are coming in from the sky. The groups of epidemiologists that I watch on the nightly news here in Australia, that's where I'm located, in Melbourne, I couldn't imagine what's going on in their heads, but they're all talking nonsense. They have the complete wrong infection model in their head. They're advising premiers like Daniel Andrews and their health officers on how to handle this thing when they've got no idea what they're dealing with. It's not going the way they say it is. So if I'm sounding exasperated and angry, it's because I am. Yes, how do people get infected with COVID-19, for example, from the meteorite dust or any source? They come in by the Oro-Nasal route. And most healthy people, when the epithelial lining is infected with the virus, which gets in through the spikes allow them to enter the cell. Most normal healthy people, and that's 99.9% of the population, we've got to keep that number clear in our head, stop the virus in its tracks. That's by a process called innate immunity. The host cell launches a massive assault on every aspect of the virus life cycle, both its genome, its assembly, its replication, and the virus simply doesn't get off the ground. It gets knocked out of the ring, literally. But in a proportion of comorbid elderly, the virus starts to replicate to varying degrees, depending how comorbid and how much and how severely that viral wall has been damaged. So that's the group we've got to look at, and then they do replicate. And in groups of closed communities of aged people, whether it be on cruise ships or in aged care facilities, the virus in those people can replicate unimpeded, and looks like it's highly infectious and contagious. when actually there's an immunity deficit in those people. They can't control the virus. So the elderly in our aged care facilities, the first requirement is to try and prevent them getting it in the first place, but you've got to then look after them through that respiratory crisis. And most can be protected or looked after that way. So from the initial infections through raw meteorite dust, we get these massive explosions of human passage viruses, and that creates the next phase of this pandemic, which is the plume that goes into the troposphere. And they're the ones that get spread around by the lower level wind systems. A lot of this emphasis that I've made on mystery cases has come from my experience of watching what's happened in Australia. See, the scale of the pandemic in Victoria, for example, is of a lower intensity than anywhere else in the Northern Hemisphere infected zone. So we can actually draw some fairly clean conclusions from what happened. A mystery case in Victoria was quite genuine, despite the political criticism against the government. They didn't have enough traces out there. They did. They were getting them all right. They were identifying all of the mystery cases. All the countries in the Northern Hemisphere infected zones with tens of thousands of cases per day. The last thing they were going to do was track down by contact tracing every single case. They couldn't do it. But you could do it in Victoria because the scale was so small. So we really know what a mystery case is. And we knew during 2020 in Victoria that any case that didn't fit the main dominant clone, the main haplotype that was ripping through the nursing homes, was a mystery case. There were lots of them, 30 to 40% of the ignitions in Victoria during the key months, June, July, August, were mystery cases. A sequence different from the dominant clones or the variants that were going through the aged care and nursing facilities. So although we don't have the detailed nature of the sequence, we have enough description of what was excluded to define a mystery case. We know it couldn't have been one of those major variants that were going through the nursing home. Now, in the case of those mystery cases, couldn't be person to person. 30 to 40% of the ignitions could not be. In the nursing homes, it would have been, because we have these massive amplifications, and of course the carers pick it up from their patients, and the carers, because they're working in multiple aged care facilities, transfer it to the next aged care facility. Look, it was a perfect storm in Victoria. Everything happened that shouldn't have happened. Yeah, I have a lot of experience in vaccines, particularly the Oro-Nasal route, that is respiratory tract and gastrointestinal tract, because I spent 5 years of my life as a young scientist working on secretory mucosal IgA. And it's very, very clear that if you want to protect the mucosal surface of the mouth, the nose, the respiratory tract and the gastrointestinal tract, you have to excite or induce by vaccination that sort of immunity, mucosal secretory IgA immunity. Now, what is secretory? Well, it's actually a dimer molecule. It has 4 antigen binding sites. It looks like a V shape, and it's joined such that it looks like a clamp. So when secretory IgA binds a toxin, a virus, or the attachment appendages on bacteria that are trying to stick to the epithelial cells, it's like a clamp, and it just completely stops these viruses and toxins dead in their tracks. In fact, secretory IgA, through its structure, is like an antiseptic paint through our mucosal surface, which stops these infections dead in their tracks. They don't even get into the cells to start causing havoc. That's why mucosal immunity is so important. Now, none of the current vaccines, unfortunately, because they're exciting blood immunity or systemic immunity in the blood, produce that sort of immunity. Giving that criticism I've given, there is a changed attitude going on. There is some development now going on, just as I speak, of Oro-Nasal vaccine route for delivery of the vaccines, but the huge outlay is from the big pharma companies, and it's all jab in the arm. So I suppose that the financial outlay by both governments and big pharma is on such a scale that it excludes all these other possible developments, currently at the moment anyway. But look, the lesson is, so we're unlikely to change that in the short term, but so the lesson for the future is that when we've got the sequence, or we know the structure of what's come in causing the pandemic, so the next one, we've got it, and it's a respiratory tract, or a cold or a flu, we have to develop the oro-nasal route of immunisation as a principle of vaccination. We just simply have to. Science primarily is dictated by evidence. When the evidence changes, a good scientist changes his mind. So that's very important. That's the first requirement of science. Secondly, when you come up with an explanation, it's got to be coherent and predictive. It's got to be actually explain a sequence of events. We believe our explanation for COVID-19 does. But it's been given no oxygen in the mainstream media. And I think that's shameful. I think the alternative explanation has got to be out there. It's got to be in the mix, and it's got to be there for intelligent, objective observers to weigh things up in terms of the type of predictions we've made and our alternative scientific explanation getting out, because it would have an impact on vaccination. It would have an impact on the nature of lockdowns. It would get us to understand and do things more rationally and differently. And so I would like to think that the world could accommodate an alternative scientific explanation for what's happened, but it clearly hasn't. And it's had knock-on effects through the production of the vaccine, to lockdowns of human population, the untold economic damage that's caused, when a cooler, rational assessment of the evidence may have led to a different set of more rational decision-making. For example, let's give an example. When it's coming in from the sky and causing mass infections, it's got nothing to do with person-to-person spread as the primary vehicle. It's because all of the different infections occurring at the same time, it looks like it's contagious. You see why it's important? And lockdowns, as we know, don't work. We know that from Victoria. We know that from many regions of the United States. They simply don't, they're not doing what the proponents said they were doing, stopping the spread and ferocity of the epidemic in that region. It had no impact whatsoever. So clearly, the scientists with an alternative explanatory mechanism for what's going on should be being listened to, but that's clearly not happening. One of the lessons is we've got to avoid the hysteria that's occurred over the past 18 months with COVID-19. A cool, rational assessment of the evidence could have helped us avoid that hysteria. One of the criteria for good science, when the evidence changes, you change your mind. And it's so crucial. All young scientists that are given a proper education when they start off are taught that. But what seems to have happened is that those cardinal principles of science have gone by the board and led by a lot of the scientific leaders. It's not just, it's a terrible situation. So alternative explanations that are rational should be on the table so they can be part of the understanding process to prevent the hysteria. And I certainly know all of my career I have corrected myself in my thinking by succumbing to the crude test, the blunt truth about the facts that I'm analysing. I don't go beyond them. I speculate and make predictions, and then if they're refuted, I no longer pursue that avenue. So that's the way science should work, and it clearly has not worked through this pandemic, and the level of hysteria has, at every level, has prevented cool, rational assessment of what's going on. It's been quite distressing to watch. To the answer to the question, how should science, what is the best way for science to operate? Well, clearly all the cards have got to be on the table, but then they've got to be allowed to be put on the table. And what's happened through this pandemic, particularly with our story, apart from the journals that we've published in and the limited interviews that I've given and Chandra's given, we just can't get the story out. I honestly, it's very, very difficult for me, to watch a lot of what's going on. I would like to think that other people, given the facts, will adjust things differently. But I have to admit, this is far more complex than I imagined. Amongst our group, it's fine, and any of those that analyse the data, it's fine. But there is clearly a wall to going to the next step. It may be a religious dimension. You see, the Judeo-Christian faith is severely tested by this explanation of life from space. That may be one of the barriers. And it's done in all sorts of ways that we don't fully understand. Now, the Asian religions, on the other hand, that know their religions are cosmically connected religions, they don't have too much problem with this. They might, balk a little bit, but they don't. Their religions are based on a cosmically connected consciousness through the cosmos. But the Judeo-Christian religions are earth-based, and maybe that's part of the barrier. I don't know, but there's certainly, I do know this. I've tried to contact many prominent people who have articulated very logical, arguments and stories about the COVID, but when I put the full Monty, if you like, to them, or where it came from, I get the eyes rolling over or a clam up. They just don't want to go there. How dangerous is COVID? Well, all of our assessment of the literature and the numbers and the proportions indicate the sort of things that I've just been talking about, in fact, that most healthy people get rid of COVID quickly, but a small fraction don't. Now, what is that proportion of the population? My estimate, looking at the unfolding epidemics and pandemics in the United States and everywhere else, including here in Victoria, I think 0.1% of all infected people die from COVID. And they are clustered almost exclusively in the elderly comorbid group. That's my summation. So all of those commentators who see it's nonsensical to lock up the entire population that is not being affected by the virus, they're right. It's not affecting 99.9% of the population. But our elderly comorbids, particularly in aged care, they have to be particularly looked after. To us, COVID-19, just to summarise its features, it's typical of all suddenly emergent diseases we've seen in history. They arrive suddenly, on scale, in a region or globally, cause havoc, whatever they do. We're lucky this is only a common cold virus. And then through a number of processes like herd immunity in the recovered population and the fact the virus decays in the environment where it lands, those two processes lead to the petering out of the pandemic. We're certain that that's what's going on now with the current pandemic. There are a few human passage plumes in India and other, but by and large, the two limiting mechanisms are herd immunity and just the natural tendency of the virus to decay in the environment. Every pandemic in history can be explained that way. They all go like that. They all come fast and then go fast, and they never come back. Do you realise that SARS-1, which is in 2002, 2003, never came back? Think about that. That was all over Southeast Asia and got as far as North America. Why didn't it come back? If it was infectious as they say, it was the one that got from the bat and jumped to human. Why didn't it come back? They don't come back. The only way they come is they get rejuvenated by new infalls from space. That's why they appear to be coming back. But the original one doesn't come back.